Okay, welcome this morning to the panel session for the 2024, it's hard for me to even say that, 2024 Adams Symposium. It's such a delight to welcome you back. The majority of our folks that are with us today are out there online, so I thank you all for signing in this morning for this important discussion. And also for those of you that are in the room, if you would silence your cell phones, that would be great for the comfort of the speakers and audiences. Well, this is just so much fun to talk about maybe topics that aren't necessarily, well, I guess we're all a little bit stressed out about democracy, but we're having a great time. We had a wonderful, let's put our hands together for Cristina Lafont for her wonderful presentation. I also want to thank our university partners, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Philosophy Department, and the Philosophy Politics and Economics program for their support of this symposium. Let's put our hands together for Lloyd Kramer, Director of Carolina Public Humanities, and all that he has done. This is his last Adams Symposium as Director of CPH, but I know you'll probably be here next year. I'm just saying, you're invited. And also, I want to put our hands together for Christy Norris and all the work that she has done for Carolina K-12 one more time. I'm going to try to do these quickly. Our staff, Kylie Seltzer, Joanna Flynn, Brian Ensminger, CPH staff have been such wonderful help setting this all up, so thank you to them. And special thanks to Paul Bonici out there making sure that our majority audience today can access our programming. And a very special thank you to Beth Gardner. Please put your hands together for Beth. This is a logistical puzzle that she figures out and stays on top of so well, and they're definitely little unexpected things that she handles perfectly. So thank you, Beth, and thank you, Paul. We also, of course, want to thank Crawford Taylor and the Taylor Charitable Trust for their incredible support. Marlene, Logan, Merrill, we know you're out there in Birmingham, and this doesn't exist without you. We are so thankful for your support. In the front of your pamphlets, I'm not going to read it to you now, but in the inside cover of your pamphlets, you'll see what Crawford Taylor wrote about Maynard Adams and the influence that Maynard Adams had on his life. And you'll get a sense of just how important it is to have ideas fueling us throughout our life. And that is certainly what Maynard did for Crawford, and that spirit lives here today. Very, very powerful example for all of us to follow. I hope we all can have someone in our lives that can inspire us as much as Maynard Adams has inspired Crawford, and then we are the beneficiaries of that wonderful inspiration. We celebrate Maynard Adams and his ideas and legacy today, and to do that, we have a very special guest who's done this before for us to give us some perspective on her father's understanding of this topic today, democracy. We've read several pieces of Maynard Adams where he was writing about civic life and political life, but from a more personal perspective, it's a real delight to welcome Jill Adams to discuss her father's legacy. So please welcome Jill Adams.
Can we lower this?
Yeah, I'll get this down.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Crawford and the Crawford Taylor Family Trust as well. This is very meaningful, and it would have been meaningful to my dad. I've been trying to channel my dad and think about how he would respond to Dr. Lafont's proposal discussion yesterday of mini publics, and I haven't been entirely successful thinking about it, but I think there's some core values that my father would have appreciated that underlie that, and those include the importance of deliberative process. He very much believed that we are people who can discuss, and particularly if we are well educated and have an education in the humanities, which he thought was central, that the process of deliberation could lead to better outcomes. The second underlying thought that I think he would really resonate with him is that we need to be sensitive and nurture the development of persons as moral beings. And I think the process that Dr. Lafont proposed would definitely involve that you have moral beings, we have citizens who are engaged and respectfully discussing with others the problems of the time. My dad was very much involved in the problems of the time. He was a frequent writer of letters to the editor. He was very involved in the civil rights movement. But one of the things that strikes me in thinking about the idea of these mini publics, my dad didn't march on the streets. I mean, he lived in Chapel Hill in a time of segregation. He grew up in Virginia. He decided he wanted to be a professor in the South because he wanted to address the issue of race and the difference of educational opportunities in the South. And so after he went to Harvard, he very much sought a position in the South because he wanted to be engaged in those activities. But I said he didn't march in civil rights marches. And I never asked him why. I was a kid, didn't have that discussion with my dad. But he took a different approach. His approach was to engage in deliberation and think about how can we structure things so that we get better outcomes. And in the civil rights arena, for him, this meant working with people in the Black community, particularly J.R. Manley, who was a minister in Chapel Hill, and some other people, to come up with what was actually became the model of the community action programs. He was the first director of the Chapel Hill Community Action Program, which later became the Orange Chatham Community Action Program. And it later got changed and was much more top-down. But the original idea of those community action programs was that you go to the community and you assess the needs by going to the community that you want to see affected. And so in Chapel Hill, they had one of the first Head Start programs. They had job training programs. And he and Reverend Manley went to Washington and talked with Sergeant Shriver about the model they developed. And it became a model that was used throughout the United States after some of the programs were developed. So his approach to the problem of civil rights was not to be in the street, but it was to say, how can we address these problems in a meaningful way through deliberation of the people most directly affected? And he did something similar with during Vietnam. He was the founder of the curriculum of peace, war, and defense, which I think still exists here. And again, it was a time of clash, of division, of strong feelings and marching in the streets. And many universities were kicking ROTC off of campus. My dad said, well, the military wants to keep ROTC on campus, but what can we do to change the nature of ROTC? And so what UNC did at that time, and I don't know how it works now, but they required students in ROTC to take courses in philosophy, in war, in literature, in history, so that there was a foundation to approach the issues of war from a humanistic perspective. And so talking about these mini publics, I think it is a way of trying to get to something besides a clash, a way of finding an approach that can recognize needs and perspectives from different people. And I think my dad would have been very, very pleased to see that.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. And yes, the Peace, War, and Defense curriculum, along with Carolina Public Humanities, is thriving thanks to your father's initiative, still a very active program. In fact, I teach a course in the PWAD program. So let's bring up our first panelists, Meredith Sheeks, Mark Hetherington, and Diane Robinson. Come on up and have a seat, and I will introduce them in just a moment. I know, exactly. So we could just shift all the cameras, but that would just take maybe 25, 30 minutes. So. And as they're coming up, why don't I tell you who these wonderful people are? Well, Meredith Sheeks, who will be up here in just a moment, is we always have an Adams Fellow as one of our respondents. A portion of our Adams Fellows are dedicated to be in the philosophy, to come from the philosophy department, and we ask one of them, who 25, 30 years ago would be a student of Maynard Adams, to respond to some of the points brought up by Dr. Lafont and our speakers. Meredith in particular brings us insights from epistemology and ethics. And by the way, I'm not going to read CVs. We have their bios there. I'm going to tell you why they're here, which I think is probably more interesting and more important. But Meredith brings us insights from epistemology and why we believe what we do. In democracy, we vote, hopefully, on what we believe to be true. And at the heart of today's polarization is the sense that Americans are living in two different worlds. So understanding how trust and truth work together and is an interesting insight. So Meredith is that's why we invited her, to see what she has to say from that perspective. Mark Hetherington, a wonderful political scientist, has spent a life looking at two Americas also, an expert on polarization and its underpinnings in the ideas of our identity and the failure of public trust as a result. So very, very apropos for today's subject. And Diane Robinson is a practitioner of democratic mobilization, dedicated to uplifting voices too often ignored by dominant political discourse, and also someone who believes in action and has dedicated a life to actually organizing and doing the hard work on the ground to make political outcomes come true. We feel like these are three incredibly important perspectives to bring to this discussion. So we turn it over now, starting with Meredith Sheeks. Please welcome our panelists.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay. In recent work, Cristina Lafont aims to motivate and defend a participatory conception of deliberative democracy. At the forefront of Lafont's project is a promising idea that the democratic ideal of self-government, namely the ideal of democracy worth fighting for at all, involves not only the ideal of political equality, but also the ideal of democratic control. The fight for political equality is but one part of the broader fight for democracy. Political equality, Lafont insists, is necessary but not sufficient for democracy. In a democracy worthy of the name, citizens must have the ability to influence the policies to which they are subject and the ability to endorse and, in some sense, identify with the policies to which they are subject. Mere political equality is not enough. And yet, foregoing discussions of deliberative democracy have valorized the ideal of political equality to the neglect of the ideal of democratic control. As Lafont argues, this is a mistake. In our contemporary political climate, many of the problems that may fall out of overemphasizing political equality and underemphasizing democratic control are pressing. We see that when our fellow citizens become alienated from their political system, when they no longer view themselves as being represented by their political system, populism rises in popularity. And unfortunately, populism is anti-democratic and exclusive. Populism asks the minorities within a political body to blindly defer to the power and authority of the majority. As populism becomes popular, technocracy, the control of the political system by a small body of so-called political experts, presents itself as an alluring solution. But technocracy is not much, if at all, better than populism. For technocracy is also anti-democratic and exclusive insofar as it asks the majority within a political body to blindly defer to the power and authority of the minority, political elites, or experts. Lafont offers her participatory conception of deliberative democracy as a compelling alternative to both the rock of technocracy and the whirlpool of populism. Alternative conceptions of deliberative democracy are, Lafont argues, largely technocratic, and we cannot save democracy without including all citizens in the process, without empowering all citizens to have an equal say in the political decisions and policies to which they are subject. In the same way that there are no shortcuts to a stable and inclusive family life, there are no shortcuts to a stable and inclusive political body. To build and restore a family, we must work with and for the family members we've, like it or not, been stuck with. Likewise, if we are to have any hope of building and restoring a democracy, we must work with and for, like it or not, the citizens we've been stuck with. All in all, I find Lafont's criticisms of alternative conceptions of deliberative democracy ambitious, timely, and incisive. Lafont, I think, is doing all of us a favor by drawing renewed attention to the importance of the ideal of democratic control for democracy. I think Lafont is correct to point out that in a phrase, more inclusion and less exclusion is the key to solving the crisis in democracy we face today. I do, however, worry that Lafont's participatory conception of democracy is in certain respects too good to be true. I worry that Lafont's proposal for a more participatory conception of democracy underestimates the appeal and comfort of blind deference to many real, everyday citizens in our midst, including perhaps ourselves. Allow me to elaborate. In Democracy Without Shortcuts, Lafont, so admirably, I think, aspires to speak to her fellow citizens as a citizen, rather than about citizens, as some say, hoity-toity coastal elite. Unlike many political philosophers today, Lafont refuses to characterize her fellow citizens as politically ignorant, irresponsible, or apathetic. She hopes to speak to her fellow citizens on their own terms. Lafont's approach is commendable. I nevertheless worry that Lafont does accidentally veer into speaking about her fellow citizens and away from speaking to them in at least one way worth flagging here today. This comes out most clearly in Lafont's characterization of the so-called problem of blind deference, which for Lafont goes hand in hand with the importance of avoiding political alienation or estrangement. Following Thomas Cristiano's suggestion, Lafont adopts the idea that citizens have a, quote, fundamental interest in being at home in society, end quote. Citizens, Cristiano suggests, have a fundamental interest in avoiding political alienation and living in a social world that conforms to their judgments. And this fundamental interest, he thinks, is rooted in citizens' sense of justice, as well as their capacity to experience the value of things around them. One's political system goes against one's sense of justice and thereby alienates one from one's own political system whenever one is forced to blindly obey laws which strike one as unreasonable or unjust. Lafont uses Cristiano's theoretical insight to then make an inference about all citizens in general. Citizens, Lafont insists, quote, are not simply concerned with their status as political equals, they are also equally concerned with the reasonableness of the laws and policies that they must obey, end quote. But even if citizens ought to be or should be so concerned with the reasonableness of the laws and policies to which they are subject, we have reason to question whether it's true that citizens today are, in fact, so concerned. I certainly wish that my fellow citizens have a sense of justice, that they are indeed concerned with the reasonableness of the laws and policies that we all must obey. Still, when I talk to my fellow US citizens in North Carolina and elsewhere about deeply contested political issues, it is not always clear to me that my fellow citizens do have a sense of justice in the way Lafont suggests. I fear that many of my fellow citizens are not all that concerned with the reasonableness of the laws and policies to which we are subject, especially when the laws and policies in effect are the ones they just so happen to favor. Many conversations today between and among fellow US citizens suggest that many of us are rather comfortable with blindly deferring to various leaders we so trust. Frequently, we do not offer direct reasons in defense of various policies or laws. US citizens frequently rely instead on blatant appeals to authority to defend their political views. Indeed, many of my fellow citizens do not trust me or my direct reasons for supporting some laws or policies over others. They dismiss my reasons out of hand, preferring instead to trust their own community leaders who assure them that they are right and that people like me are wrong. My experiences in talking to my fellow citizens are not unique. To name just one example, many undergraduate students here at UNC, especially those who come to Chapel Hill from more rural areas in North Carolina, report losing much of the trust of their local community members simply because of their choice to attend a quote-unquote liberal school. Following their decision to attend school in Chapel Hill, these students report being sidelined, dismissed as brainwashed, or no longer worth being reasoned with by their fellow community members back home. Upon reflection, I regret to admit that I myself am not always faithfully concerned with the sheer reasonableness of the laws and policies I support, even though I would like to be. And I suspect too that despite your good intentions, you are not always so concerned either. Maintaining a concern with the sheer reasonableness of the laws and policies we support is an extremely difficult task. For all of us, blind deference can at times be as convenient and comforting as the best of Southern cooking. Again, I sincerely hope that most of my fellow citizens have a sense of justice at the end of the day in the sense Lafont is concerned with. Ideally, we all would, all of the time. But if we and our fellow citizens do not, in fact, always maintain and act upon a deep sense of justice, then we should at least be aware of this fact when considering new tools, practices, or institutions that may serve to solve our current crisis in democracy. The institutionalization of many publics, for example, offers us a promising avenue for rendering our political systems more participatory and inclusive. Yet the extent to which institutionalized mini publics can, in fact, empower all citizens and reduce political alienation is inevitably going to be limited by whether we as citizens are, in fact, at the end of the day, concerned with the reasonableness of the laws and policies we support. In order for many publics or other solutions to work, we as citizens must take care to maintain and strengthen our own sense of justice. At the same time, we must embolden our fellow citizens to do the same. Otherwise, our own comfortability with blind deference to our favorite authorities, be they political, religious, or other, will continue to hold us back from taking the democratic control that I do believe is in our own best interest to have, even if we don't always recognize it as such. The beauty of Lafont's work is that it inspires us, once again, to not take the ideal of democratic control for granted. Democratic control, just like our sense of justice, is something we must fight to not only achieve, but also to maintain. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Mark Hetherington, and one thing I want to point out right from the beginning is I was chatting with Meredith at the desk over there, and I asked, well, how long's your presentation? And she said 11 minutes, and she had the clock running, and it was 10 minutes and 59 seconds. It was incredible precision there. Don't expect that from me. You reach a certain age and, I remember, being a relatively new faculty member and thinking, oh God, 11 minutes is a long time, to fill up. And, now at my stage, I'm like, I better get started if I have 11 minutes. Well, anyway, I come to you all from the political science world. And the thing that I study is public opinion through the use of survey research. And survey research has been around for 70 or so years. And many of the ideals that people who started the study of public opinion had in mind came crashing to the ground as soon as they started to actually study mass publics. It's a depressing train of research. And I do come out of that tradition. However, one of the things that turns out to be the case is I end up being uniquely suited to talk about many deliberative bodies, which I'll get to in a minute. So what does my perspective lend to understanding the potential of many deliberative bodies to help us with the crisis of democracy that we seem to be facing? The first thing I'd like to say is that I am actually very worried about the state of democracy in the US and abroad. I'm not like many academics trained in the tradition that I come from. There tends to be this sort of sense of, we've been here before, we've seen it, it's not as bad as it was, during, this period or that period. I tend to think actually it is as bad as this period or that period right now. So I want to make clear I come from that particular perspective. And coming up with solutions to the problems that are associated with party polarization is extraordinarily difficult. If it was easy, we would have solved those problems already. But that's not what's happened. And in that sense, I really admire Professor Lafont and anyone else who tries to chart a different course. It's something I've been working at too, and it's something I've experienced far more failures with than I have successes. I'm just trying to figure out how to encourage Republicans to think differently or Democrats to think differently in a way that gets us towards a more unified way of seeing the world. And that's something I'll come back to in a little bit too. In fact, I find teaching very difficult now, especially teaching the kinds of classes I do on public opinion and political parties. Students often, during the course of the term, complain. They literally complain about how depressing studying these things is. There doesn't seem to be a lot of hope about what the future looks like based on what we know about public opinion, how it behaves, the incentives that political parties have now in the present polarized political system to have it remain, in a sense, as it is. So with that in mind, being part of this event gave me a real shot in the arm. And I see plenty of potential in democracy without shortcuts. And let me give you a little background as to why. When I was a graduate student a very long time ago, nearly 30 years ago, I actually was part of the first national deliberative opinion poll. The person who was the intellectual force behind it is a professor who was at Texas then, is now at Stanford, named James Fishkin. And his sort of empirically minded right-hand man was my dissertation supervisor, Bob Luskin. And as a result, I got an opportunity to sit in the small group sessions, meet with the people who came from all around the country. This was a randomly selected group of people to come to Austin, Texas, to deliberate about various different issues. And I found it absolutely amazing and uplifting, and also sad at times. But the seriousness of purpose that people brought to the table was really amazing. One thing, so in that sense, if people are chosen or become part of these types of things, what I saw from the inside is that they will take it seriously. They will, feel the weight of the moment in a way that maybe our representatives, at least we have in our mind, ought to feel about things. It was really something in that respect. I should also add that one of my PhD students, a fellow named Isaac Mulhoff, he recently finished his dissertation on deliberation, and he's in Chicago now. He's a fellow at the University of Chicago. You guys will have to get together. What his work suggests, though, that I think is very important and central to the conversation here, is that deliberation must be active. It can't be passive. So in that sense, what Isaac suggests and shows in his dissertation is that argumentation is what's important. the kind of passive in our heads deliberation, where you tell somebody, well, this is what the other side has in mind, you think about it. That doesn't work particularly well, because when we do things in our head, we don't necessarily engage those ideas very completely. We process lazily. But think about the times that you all have engaged in active argumentation. Of course, your blood pressure probably goes up, and that's probably not the best thing for maintaining a deliberative mindset. But what does go on is that you think carefully about your arguments in a way that you don't think carefully about your arguments when you're just inside your own head. Sometimes saying something causes you to process that thinking in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. And what Isaac shows in his work is that when people are forced into articulating their beliefs, going back and forth with people, it decreases people's certainty that they have in their own opinions, and it moderates the opinions both that they have about themselves, but also causes them to see the other side in a light that's much more positive than if there's no deliberation, or if the deliberation just takes place in one's head. So active argumentation has got to be part of it. It's what moderates us. And I should say, as his dissertation supervisor, this is not anything I expected at the beginning of things. As somebody who's trained in American political behavior, my thinking was that argumentation would cause us to become more tribal, stronger in our beliefs. And this was one of those great moments where you think, oh, the student knows more than me. And it really worked out that way. Now, that said, so that I want to, at the beginning, express my enthusiasm. But I think one of the roles that I have to play as the empiricist on the panel is to suggest, some reasons for concern about this approach to things. And so I'll, briefly sort of suggest a few of those things just for the room's consideration. And this, I think, holds true, some of them hold true especially acutely in this polarized time. The first of these things is motivation. The notion of rational ignorance, which Professor Lafont made some sport of yesterday, that political scientists talk about. The idea is that it's thought to be, in a sense, rational for people not to know very much, because they can use these shortcuts and reach the same place that they would otherwise if they had more complete information. I just note that the notion of rational ignorance was really meant to resuscitate the public, because the public on paper looks so pathetic. They don't know things. 2/3 of people don't know that there are 3 institutions that make up the federal government. Much less, 20% of people didn't know who the vice president was when spotted his name after Joe Biden had been vice president for 3 years. The level of ignorance is remarkable. And I think what political scientists were trying to do is say, well, maybe there just aren't enough incentives to overcome the motivation shortfall that we have among ordinary citizens. And, so in that sense, rational ignorance is not some normative ideal that political scientists have for the public. It's not meant to keep them quiet. It's meant to suggest that people want to take shortcuts. A key thing then is to figure out how to discourage people from taking those shortcuts. Second thing that I think is important for us to be mindful of is a psychological issue that we run against, and that is, what goals do people have in their information processing? Do they have accuracy goals? We have in mind that everybody wants to be accurate in their beliefs, but that's just simply not true. Another type of goal that is suggested by social psychologists is directional goals. In a sense, the approach is that rather than wanting to be right, people want to continue to believe what they want to believe, whether it's not right or not. Whether it's not right or whether it is right. This is something that is especially problematic in this sort of polarized time, where people dislike the other side so much that they don't want to provide even an inch of agreement with those who disagree, who have different ideas politically. So we have to be mindful of the notion that accuracy is not always what people have in mind. You know, it might be what we as scholars would have in mind, or as philosophers would have in mind, but most people don't have that in mind, at least right now. Another thing that we have to be mindful of is what information would be provided to the many deliberative panels. Who would produce it? Would it be trusted by the people who are the participants? We run into an issue right now where the only source of information, at least news source of information, that Republicans, more than 50% of Republicans trust right now, is Fox News. On the Democratic side, Democrats tend to believe, more than half of Democrats believe almost any news source other than Fox News. So that's a big issue. This is a practical problem that when it comes to what information is provided to deliberators will be A, appropriate, who provides that, and B, whether it will be believed. People tend to believe things that they trust, and that's sort of an issue. Another thing that I want us to ask about democracy right now is, why is it imperiled right now? What is the issue? I mean, we've had these institutions for a really long time, and I don't think it is the injection of, say, new institutions like social media and things like that into the process, or partisan news. In fact, we've had partisan news before. In the 1800s, we had a partisan press that allowed people just to expose themselves to what they wanted to be exposed to. It was a terrible time, but it didn't bring down the republic either. So I want us to think hard about the why now question, and it's going to lead me to something that I think is going to challenge some people's thinking in this room. So if you think about social media, I think that reinforces the problems that already exist. Did Trump cause it? I actually think Trump is more of a symptom of what was building before. What I suggest in my work is what we're divided about is, what polarizes us is what we are specifically divided about. So in a bygone era during, the New Deal party system, we were divided about something that wasn't in people's, guts. That is, like, how big government ought to be. Who knows? A little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, a little more regulation. We could compromise on those things. But right now, what we're polarized about is groups. We're polarized about race. We're polarized about ethnicity as it relates to immigration. We're polarized about gender. We're polarized about sexual orientation. We're polarized about all of these things. And what I want us to kind of think about, in a sense, is if our polarization is about generating equality for these groups that have been discriminated against for generations, centuries, then is polarization such a bad thing? We think about polarization as something that, puts us on the road to democratic ruin. But if we go back to the 1940s or the 1950s and ask, well, are women better off? Are people of color better off? Are LGBT people better off? I think the answer is absolutely. And as such, the polarization that we're experiencing based on the fights over those equality questions are certainly worth having. And maybe one side is fighting very hard and potentially undermining democratic norms against those fights, but I think they were worth having, even if it puts the Republicans some discomfort right now. So I'll come to a close there. I wish I was 10 minutes, but I notice I'm 15. Sorry about that.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. Well, I am not an academic, so don't let these papers fool you. And I'll try to sort of put the thoughts that I've had about the subject. When Lloyd asked me to do this, I said yes, because Lloyd asked me to do it. And then I looked at what I was saying yes to. I said, why am I doing this? And then on top of that, my cloning machine is broken, and I should be at the CD4 Democratic Convention, which happens to be today, but because they're Democrats, we're not organized, and they didn't have a date when I accepted this. So that's all to say that, we are here because we all care about the subject and welcome those who are online. And I've been thinking about the things that were said in addition to Christina's paper about why I'm here. And I came to this country as an immigrant from Jamaica in the 1950s. And I grew up in Jamaica, Queens. I say my parents went there because they could spell it. And I lived there until I went to college in Cleveland. I've traveled most of the 50 states and lived in several of them, including Indiana and Maine, very different. And then I moved here from the Rio Grande Valley of Texas over 30 years ago. And as I said last night, I came kicking and screaming because Texas was a Democratic state when I lived there, and North Carolina had just elected Jesse Helms, rejecting Harvey Gantt. And I have mixed race children, and I said, and why am I doing this? But I came and watched what I thought was an increasing improvement in the democratic and justice. I was so happy to hear you use the word justice. I hadn't put that in any of these words, but that's really what drives me and why I do what I do. And so I watched that progress. One of the best examples, I would say, which led to a very positive electoral process in 2008 was one-stop early voting, which passed the General Assembly here, I think, in 2004. And after that, we saw the increased participation of the electorate from across the state, not just particular groups, not just particular geographies. So that all was very good and very positive. And here we are, grappling at a time of crisis of democracy. And I appreciate, the comment that what we're grappling with now is an increasing tribalization and breakdown of groups that I hope we come out on the other side better as we've watched history over time. But I do think it's really critical that we see this time as different than other times. I don't think this is just continued expansion of that push-pull, one step forward, two steps back, two steps forward, one step back, because we have, I think, particular differences now that require more people to be in this room and more people to be active in their communities in order to, as I say, live to fight another day. And I say that in the context of a partisan. I am a partisan. I wish we had more parties and more conversation and more deliberation, but we have been a country built on a two-party system. They've changed and been different, but basically that's what we've been since the beginning. One party has left democracy. That's the difference now, I see it. One party has abdicated and said the democracy is not what we are deliberating about. I'll argue with you on that on the side. So how do we improve public opinion and the quality of debate? It has been noted that many in the academy have taken the research from the classroom to the public square. My daily news diet often contains reading from Substack by historians, political scientists, practitioners, and philosophers who have ventured beyond the academy and mainstream media to bring their voice forward. Heather Cox Richardson, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Mark Elias, Robert Hubble are some of the people that I listen to and read because I find that even our best news sources, the New York Times, the Washington Post, are driven by the headline writers and not by the content of what's in the story. So if you only read the headlines, you get a very different perspective about what's happening in this country. And I think that certainly adds to the tribalism and the polarization that we all are experiencing. So this program today seems to be an understanding that we have to stop that march toward authoritarianism and fascism. That is, we are going in that direction. I think the signs are very clear. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is one of the people that scholars on this subject quoted just yesterday or the day before, what draws me in as a scholar of autocracy is the amazing and beautiful and never to be taken for granted fact that this trial, the one that started Monday, is happening at all. A similar trial could never happen in Turkey today or in Russia, China, or Hungary. And I added, for now. For now. If we just read the headlines of last week from national to local news, it would demonstrate the challenges that our democracy experience are very real. We have the criminal trial of a malignant narcissist who was once the president of this country and could be again. And I just have to stop to hear myself say those words, that is where we are in this very moment. The North Carolina Board of Elections is strained, as in many states, in large part because of the false belief that our electoral system is flawed. So therefore, they can't get enough people to work to implement all of these voter suppression laws that have been put in place to make sure that we have fair elections. It is understaffed, just as these new rules are going, that are supposed to be for voter integrity, go into effect. These are just 21st century forms of voter suppression and disenfranchisement. But that's happening today in North Carolina. You can just look at the new vote by mail ballot. You would almost need a PhD to figure out how to use it and how to fill it out, and the number of steps and requirements and envelopes and signatures and witnesses. And yes, copy of your voter ID has to be included, and it has to be included in the right envelope. And that envelope has to be signed in the right place. And then you have to find 2 witnesses to say that you are who you say you are. And then you have to put it in a very big envelope with a big stamp and get it in so it is there exactly at 7:30 on election day, not 1 minute later. Had been 3 days after. That's today. The North Carolina NAACP is challenging the voter ID law in court the first week of May, next month. I was in the courtroom when it started in 2019, and we are still ambling through that. The North Carolina General Assembly this week has offered $300 million for opportunity scholarships, voucher education, robbing and dismantling public education. I see what is happening in public education in our public institutions of higher education as a major factor contributing to the crisis in democracy, because you cannot have democracy without education and understanding. To personalize this, I was in 4th grade when I learned that there were 3 branches of government. I don't know that a 4th grader today knows that. That is, and I went to a public school in New York. I don't know that that was the same across, but I feel like we have decreased our teaching of the basics of education, and now what is it they've substituted here? The School of Civic Life and Leadership. Now, I would have a much better feeling about that if I trusted what the impetus for that was and the underpinnings of why we have that here at the university. But you get my point, and I respect where I am. This week, abandoning diversity, equity, inclusion education at the University of North Carolina. That was also in the headlines this week. So we can be, and these are not my words, so we can be like Florida. Sadly, even at the local level, our towns are showing the stress of what seems to be the growth for growth's sake and forcing decisions and technocrats and consultants without buy-in from the community. So here in the towns that we live in, we have this increased tension between those who are elected, and I will say they act as though they were elected by a mandate. Less than 30% of registered voters vote in municipal elections. So therefore, as we talk about mini publics and buy-in, there isn't really any. What causes this deterioration in civic engagement? this deep sense of political alienation and polarization. Dr. Lafont addresses this in the paper that she shared, and I won't review what has been said. But basically it is that we do not have engagement of the people for whom, the minority voices and the majority voices for whom these things are happening. And I will say that your point that we now have such discrete groups that have not come to, no, I don't even want to use, whose goals and interests are being held as being separate as opposed to being unified. I want to, I found this and I thought, oh, I got to read this to the folks here today. So one of our committees was in Congress this week. Representative Higgins from Louisiana, the ranking member, said, "The founders never anticipated this volume of illegals." Representative Raskin, Democrat from Maryland, "There was no immigration law when the Constitution was adopted at all. In fact, the only illegals in the country, at least according to the Native American population, were the people writing the Constitution." So this is, here we are, certain amount of diversity in this room. This is not the country that the Constitution was written for, and yet our judicial system, our legislators, our gerrymandered legislatures that do not really reflect the diversity have forced this kind of division. I truly believe that if democratic processes really were at work, we would not have this alienation and polarization, this pulling apart. But we are a country that was built on two original sins of stolen land and stolen labor, and we are paying the price for that as we speak. We are not, until we are able to really address, and I was so heartened to hear about your father and what he did with Reverend Manley, who I did get to know before he died. An amazing opportunity of seeing that we cannot move forward unless we move together and doing something about that in their way. So I see that it is really imperative for everybody in this room to do something. I think that's why Lloyd asked me to come, to do something, whether it is being an active part of your precinct. If you, as I said, one party has left democracy, so you have one choice to be involved in a partisan way. Even if you're independent, you have principles that have to be voted in 2024 if we are to live to fight another day. If you're a member of a faith group, that you pushing your faith group to recognize that they cannot live their faith outside of understanding the injustices that come by our retreat. I mean, I hear all the, I'm not political. Well, you breathe, you pay taxes, you are political. We can't use that as, we can't accept that as an excuse. Somehow we have to find the way to get to that person and explain to them that their lack of politics is somebody else's politics, and in a way that may not necessarily be what they would want. I think that we do have a responsibility, those of us who understand, to help others to become human beings in the best sense of the word, because we are losing that perspective of what it is to be human. I made the comment that we're here in this building, which is getting bigger and more investment in resources and technocrats. Yes, we need business, and what do we have on the other side for the humanities? The humanities are really shrinking in our liberal education. In fact, unless we fight for it, we won't have it. So I do see this election as kind of a do or die moment, if not for the country, certainly for North Carolina. We have got to win this election or we will be Florida.
Thank you to our panelists, Meredith Sheeks, Mark Hetherington, and Diane Robinson. We now invite Cristina Lafont to respond to these comments, and also, of course, to create a conversation. So, Cristina, come on up.
Yeah, right, you're right. We didn't think of that. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for your comments. I mean, they are so excellent and so complex that I don't know I can respond to everything that you are referring to and suggesting. Is a lot. I mean, and a lot of it has to do with a lot of things I say in the book, but then I won't fall for the temptation of now repeating what I say there or whatever. But okay, let me see if I can focus on some key questions, and then maybe we have a discussion. If I forget some of the things, we can get back to them. I want to start with Jill's comments because you just got it right. And it's amazing because apparently you didn't know about mini-publics. But this is the thing about mini-publics that, and you have mentioned some of those aspects. Mini-publics do something because people get together face to face in active deliberation in a context that moralizes them. They face individuals, human beings. They know they are ordinary citizens like them. All of that changes the perspective of how you go into a discussion of politics, right? That we usually have, where you need to identify who is in your group, who are the others, the enemy, the whatever. You can't do that in the mini-public. And that brings in this moral education, this empathy, this solidarity, this listening to literally what the reasons are and what bothers people and why they are worried about something, right? For example, there has been many mini-publics on transgender issues. And if you look at the poll research, right, I think it's by now 80% of people know someone who is gay, right? 15% of people know someone who is transgender. That means they have never heard a transgender person saying anything at all about what's the problem they have, right? So they have opinions on bathrooms they have never heard. In a mini-public, you bring a couple of transgender people with no matter who else is randomly selected. The change of mind is brutal, is unbelievable, and that has been tried again and again, all right? So you see, what difference does it make if you talk to the affected people and they just tell you in plain language what problems they have, then if you get informed by someone third hand about whatever, also with manipulation, right? That explains why mini-publics are so special, because it's kind of democracy in action as it should be, but it usually isn't, because we are subject to many forces. So that is what is special. So if it were only that people get informed about the technical aspects of things, they could get informed by reading stuff. You could send them home pamphlets about whatever issues they are thinking about. The direct experience with the affected people brings this moral dimension that makes all the difference about what they think. And to me, that has these two aspects. It has an aspect which is being informed really is important. If you don't even know who is the vice president, it's very hard for you to vote more or less correctly. You don't know the candidates. I mean, that's really bad. But if you have never heard what the problems are on the other side, right, of what they are worried about and what interests of them are really being violated, etc., you cannot make up your mind in a democratic, inclusive way, right? So that just to the first aspect in which I think you just capture it, because a lot of people, by being called deliberative, think that the emphasis is kind of epistemic, is on what you learn. Well, yes, it's what you learn, but it's what you learn morally, not just what you learn technically, right, in terms of information about policies, right? So that's kind of why mini-publics are very interesting in a way. And you just got it right in my view, so I have nothing to add or change about it. Okay, so you got me in trouble, because if I say what I'm gonna say to you, then Diane is not gonna like it. So how do I handle this? I'm gonna throw the problem to you guys rather than me, right? Okay, so there is something in my book that you didn't get, which I have to reveal in a way. Okay, so you are saying, well, I'm trusting that people have a sense of justice, and that they really care about whether policies are reasonable. But we can think of so many people in so many contexts where people do not exercise that sense of justice at all. maybe because they exercise their self-interest. This is the famous first motivation, that to the motivation question you were asking, or simply because they are manipulated. I mean, there are so many reasons, right? So if you read my book carefully as the whole book, eventually you will get it, that I'm putting the burden of moving forward for justice on the affected themselves. It's not that I'm thinking that people are going to have a sense of justice when someone else is being treated unjust. I'm putting a burden which is unfair on those whose rights have been violated, being able to fight for justice against the other, mobilize them, etc. So that is built in my model, because I have an institutional model, I must say. So it's not an interactional book. Even though I start talking to citizens, I'm trying to find institutional solutions, because I think that when you put people in the right institutions, things work, even though they may be too busy to care about politics, doing their own stuff, etc. Institutions discharge this burden that we will have if we just had to be all the time doing the right thing, right? So I look for institutional solutions that will allow people to mind their own business and not being political at all. Take shortcuts. I think informational shortcuts are fine. So deferring to political parties, for example, or people we trust, to me, that's perfectly fine. So that's not blind. Blind is deferring to people who, for all you know, could decide any way at all. Like, that's what I call blind deference. That is unacceptable, I think, right? Where you just simply, you lose control in the absolute sense, right? But deferring, not taking shortcuts, a la Lupia, right? Because of your party. I don't know a lot of things that are going to be decided. I vote Democratic, and then I trust that I share the values and the goals that they have right now. And it's not ideal, it never is, but it's better than the opposite. To me, that's a perfect shortcut. It's an informational shortcut. But I am in the driver's seat because I think I'm decided based on thinking that they share my values and my aims, and I don't need to figure out all the details. So those shortcuts are fine. The ones that are not fine are the ones where I will be deferring to the majority. What does that mean? The majority can go anyway. They may go against my sense of justice. They may screw me as a minority. I mean, that's not democratic, right? So that's how low the bar is for me. But you got it. Like, my model depends on those who are pushing and fighting, who are motivated, are those whose sense of justice is being violated. And my model depends on that. And the question is, do they have the institutions they need to be able to put up that fight, right? But it's true. In a society where the immense majority couldn't care less and about the sense of justice vis-a-vis those who are the victims, you can have a democracy, and you are right. But that's why my book is, sometimes it's optimistic and sometimes it's pessimistic. It's saying, no, that's how it is, because you cannot put the burden on someone else because they don't know. You can put the burden, it's very unfair to put burdens on such a tiny group like transgender people. It's like, wait, you're putting the burden on a very few people for 300 million communities. Like, it's an impossible burden. The thing is, could you put it somewhere else? No, they don't. No one else understands what the problem is. They have to tell us, so to say, what the problem is, why is it wrong? And it's unfair on the one hand, on the other, there is no alternative. Because even if you wanted someone else to get informed, these are typically, when it's issues of justice, it's never technicalities. It's always moral experience, first-hand experience, and you cannot substitute for the affected, right? And so that much about how it works. I'm looking for institutional solutions because, for example, if you look at many publics, looking at literally those cases, how people immediately change their minds, but to an extent that even the people who are experimented, Fishkin and all of them, are astonished. Like, nobody expected that, really. And they were going with the law of polarization from Kant's Sunstein, thinking that in many publics people will polarize. They don't. And by now they think it's because of this randomness, because people can't see themselves as in groups anymore, because people are from completely different walks of life, and then they start more as individuals, and then they have these kind of moral experiences. That's probably the reason why it works there. But the idea is that if you can put people in the right institutions, you can change things that look impossible, right? In the daily life, people are not going to exercise this kind of moral judgment. But when you put them in a mini public, it's like magic, right? They change completely. Well, the thing is, can we use that as something that will help us all the ones who are not participating in the parties. That's the difficulty, right? To make things better for ourselves. I do think that with the right institutions, we don't have to be defeatists, right? It's like we think almost nothing can be changed, only in the margins, right? But sometimes I think, wait a second, remember, there was no literacy, right? A couple of centuries ago, no one could read. Women could not read like a couple of decades ago, right? Humanity decided we are going to have literacy for everyone, and we did it. Excuse me, to me, this is amazing, and it changed everything. Okay, if we could pull that one off, we can pull a lot off. So I don't want to be that defeatist to think, oh my God, we can only change in the margins, it's all the same, there's nothing we can do. It's like, no, we have done amazing things. At least for women, extraordinary. In my lifetime, my mother and me, the difference that it makes, right? So we can do amazing things. So we just need, in my view, the right institutions to do it. Okay, so that's what I will say about the combination between being realist and being idealist or something. So all your concerns about the motivation that people have, like everything that we know about the situation on the ground as it is right now is really very bad. And so I think we need to have make some fundamental changes in order to prevent that. But I think we can. I really think when you put people in different situations, they have different motivations, they do things differently than they otherwise do. And that way you can get things done. So that's what I would say. Now on the polarization, what we are polarized about, as you know, there's this debate about, there are two reasons why we may be polarized. One is more economic and the other is more identity politics. And I think both are probably right to some extent. So one is those who feel that they are losing status, etc., because they are the losers of globalization. That's the more economic explanation. I was pointing out a little bit yesterday about it, right? That we, in fact, did put people in worse situation than they were by globalizing the economy in a neoliberal way without providing kind of the type of safety nets, etc., that they would have needed, and now they are very resentful. But of course, we also have then the identity politics that we always did and the divisions among groups. I don't know that we need to decide what we are polarized about, because it's probably some combination of economics and culture. I mean, I think that applies to any country, basically. There's always these two very important aspects of people's life. I am more with Diane. I think what is special is not what we are polarized about. It's true that it changes over time, but in some way, the group's polarization, women, minorities, African Americans, I mean, that has always been the case. I mean, these are the groups always fighting for their rights, right? So in a way, it's not that new. It could be a backlash because of the progress that has been made for women, for LGBTQ, etc., right? And yes, and because Obama became a president, maybe this is a backlash. But frankly, I'm completely with Diane. What I think is special is not the content of what we are polarized about, whatever explanation you prefer. What is special is that in a two-party system, one party has abandoned democracy, and you cannot have that. We have the same phenomena in all over Europe. All countries of Europe have now an authoritarian right-wing, extreme right-wing party, right? But because they don't have a two-party system, you know, wherever, you figure out what you do. In Hungary, we know what has happened, right? Or in Poland, but in my own country, in Spain, in Germany, in other countries, in France, right? Because you have other parties, then you see what you do. And it's bad, but we don't know. You can't afford that with a two-party because you don't have democracy if you only have one party. And so that can be the solution. So the very fact that even serendipitously, we got the wrong leader in the wrong time at the wrong moment to actually destroy a party and make it into a populist authoritarian party, that may be serendipitous, but I think this is where we are, why we are in a special moment compared to the past. I don't think the democracy of the United States, no matter how bad it has been in so many ways, ever had a taking over of an authoritarian who may leave the institutions looking the way they do, but actually dismantle them from the inside, a la Hungary. I don't think there was such experience in the United States, and I don't know if it happens, then what we do. So I really think that what is particularly threatening has to do with the democratic institutions. no matter what else we are polarized about. And it's just because of that that it's so dangerous that people don't realize what we need to save are the institutions. And then we will get to fight for another day. But if we don't have them, doesn't matter what happens to women and LGBTQ people and what policies we pass. We just cannot do that ourselves. We will have an authoritarian who will possibly remain in power forever. That's a very different kind of thing. I lived through that type of situation when I was growing up. I know the kind of thing that it is, what it does. It has nothing to do with solving the problems we have among ourselves. So that's, I don't know what I will say. And with that, I'm already speaking about what Diane was saying. Yes, we need to do something. Everybody has to do something. I think that's something that academia can do, academics can do on top of whatever they do also politically as citizens. What they can do as academics in these areas, in the humanities, in political science, especially in this type of disciplines, is two things. One is to take the problem seriously and try to come up with solutions. And the second is not leave it within. That's what I'm trying to do, because I must say, I was so happy yesterday to see the reaction, and I have had it already in the past. When you talk to people who are not academics about mini publishing, what could be done, etc., you realize the potential that has really outside academia. If you keep it just as a specialized thing, I could have been talking about mini publishing in a way that no one would have understood anything. It would have been technical, exactly about how you do it, how you organize it, or whatever, right? That's fine, but so we need to reach out. And I think that should count, even for Diane's criteria, as doing something, because you really need to come up with ideas of things that are institutional. People on the street are not going to think that way, right? And that can be the solution. It's just that not happening between now and November. You get that point too, but still, we should be doing both. Okay.
Those who know better have to do better.
Yeah.
In order for us to fight another day. And your point is right. Those who are most affected by the injustice have always been the tip of the spear fighting for that, but they've had allies.
Right.
And I feel like the alliances have become weakened and disinterested. And to your point about the students who are coming into the school, can I make one observation? Several years ago, after they had destroyed the Poverty Center, then they decided that they now needed to get rid of the civil rights division within the law school programs that were training lawyers to be civil rights lawyers. The last remnant of the post-1964 period, if you look at 64 to today. So I went with the NAACP with our yellow armbands to sit in on the governor with that group that met to discuss it. And there were a lot of us. There were about 5 young students on the other side against the Civil Rights Center. So after the meeting, I went over to one of them and I said, why are you against civil rights being taught at the law school? Well, we don't think state money should be used to fight against the state. I said, well, it isn't state money. This is a nonprofit within the law school. And what I realized, they've been recruited to be there, these young students. What I realized is that was the goal. The goal is that those are the students they want at the law school. And if you have civil rights training, you're going to get kinds of people from all over the country coming to your law school, learning about civil rights, and they might actually run into the General Assembly, and they might start making rules and laws that are against what you want. And, that is not conspiratorial. That is exactly what's happening. If you eliminate the things that create that kind of deliberation and institutional tension and friction and bringing tribal groups together, then you might end up having legislation that really reflects the plurality of the country. So what we're seeing happening is this slicing, voucher money for schools to balkanize public education, minimize the quality of education, and continue to minimize quality of education in rural areas that never did get where they were supposed to be because the ANDRA was never implemented. So, I see North Carolina as this laboratory right now, right on the edge, to go one way or the other with this whole question of how democracy is going to thrive and move forward. And, you know, just seeing it right here within the institution that my check does not depend on. So I realize that academics here are really in a kind of tough place because there's just so far you can go and keep your job or leave.
I want to thank our panelists. I'm sorry that we've hit the time for our first panel, but let's please put our hands together for Meredith Jeek, Mark Hetherington, Diane Robinson, and once again for Cristina Lafont. And we invite you all to enjoy some refreshments in the hallway, and those on the online audience, enjoy your own refreshments, but come back for panel number 2. We'll see you soon. Thank you.